is the world this weekend. Hello, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Rescuers in Morocco are in a race against time to save survivors of Friday's massive earthquake.
Most of homes are destroyed. People are still they didn't get help yet. People are still under the rocks. People are still suffering.
Also, colleagues remember a Canadian aid worker killed in Ukraine.
There's not one person I could think of that would have something bad to say about Tonko. The world will miss people like him very much.
And Canada's top soldier remembers a largely forgotten peacekeeping mission.
Every building in that village was on fire. The smoke, the flames is something I will never forget.
That's later, but first. With time running out to save survivors of Morocco's earthquake, rescue efforts have intensified in the mountains near Marrakech. More than 2,100 people have been killed. But with many remote villages still inaccessible, that number looks certain to rise. Our correspondent Chris Brown has gone into the quake zone and sends this report.
The drive out of Marrakech up into the Atlas Mountains is windy and boulders still litter the highway, but at least now most debris is cleared and a path for rescuers is open. Time is running out though. Moulay Brahim, a town of 5,000 people, is near the epicenter. At least 25 people were killed here in their homes Friday night. Others may still be alive under the bricks and rock. We met Mohsin, whose mother was home by herself when the shaking caved in her home. He hopes miraculously maybe she's alive. She couldn't run away, he said, because she's too old. In the building next to hers, there could be 2 or 3 more people buried. Residents said they could hear screams coming from inside the next day. Hardly any homes here now are fit to live in. Rashida told us, we just sleep outside, me and my 2 kids. We have nowhere else to go. Survivors seemed shell-shocked. Ahmed Bolal carefully took us into his shattered home. It's been in his family for generations. He, along with a brother and a sister who now lives in Moncton, was raised here. I have tears in my eyes. This is where my father grew up. The whole village is like this, he said. There have been rescues here, but the funerals have also begun. With so many smaller villages in these mountains only getting access now, and with the damage possibly far worse than in Moulay Brahim, the worry is the number of dead will climb much higher. Morocco's government has started setting up relief centers with tents and food for those who've lost everything, and with loved ones missing, the immensity of what's been taken from them is too much to comprehend. Chris Brown, CBC News in Moulay Brahim, Morocco.
The G20 summit has ended and world leaders have departed New Delhi, except Justin Trudeau, who is staying behind with his delegation after mechanical issues were discovered on his plane. As things were wrapping up, Canada's Prime Minister had a tete-a-tete with India's Narendra Modi. Karina Roman has been following Trudeau on this trip. As she tells us, relations between the 2 leaders were visibly strained from the start.
If it was just up to me, the leaders' declaration would have been much stronger.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau acknowledges the section of the leaders' joint declaration on Ukraine is not what Canada wanted.
If it was just up to other countries around the table, it would have been much weaker. The G20 is an extremely disparate group, and we worked very hard to get as strong language as we possibly could.
But there's no denying the language in the joint statement is weaker than last year's. It does not condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, as was done at last year's summit. Ukraine's foreign ministry said the G20 has nothing to be proud of, and Russia is claiming victory.
I think it's well established that we can't believe anything that Russian officials or diplomats say, full stop.
But experts say it is indeed a failure. Tristan Naylor is a professor of international politics at the University of Cambridge and the deputy director of the G20 research group.
Just thinking of the paragraph on the war in Ukraine, it is even more watered down than the watered down paragraph we had last year at the Bali summit. So in many ways, I think we've taken a step backwards.
And Naylor dismisses claims by India that because consensus was reached, the summit was a success.
If a communique is what we want, if that's the goal of these summits, then we've got what everybody came here to get. But if what we want is something substantive, something robust, and something that advances on the big issues that really matter, I don't think that we achieve that here.
Although Naylor does say getting the leaders of the 20 largest economies together in one place is a feat in itself, and issues were likely advanced through all the one-on-one meetings and conversations on the sidelines. As host, India has been deliberate in pushing its message, its slogan, "One Earth, One Family, One Future." But it's a veneer of unity, as the geopolitical divisions over Russia's war on Ukraine overshadowed the goals of tackling climate change, food insecurity, and inequality. There was also clear tension between Trudeau and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Every public interaction here between the two was stilted and awkward. Trudeau skipped Modi's gala dinner last night and missed an event on biofuels promoted by Modi. But Trudeau sidestepped questions about it.
We have always had a good relationship.
Diplomatic relations have suffered recently, stemming from a long-standing Sikh separatist movement in Canada, and Trudeau's vocal support for protesting farmers in India. As well, Canada has suspended free trade talks with India. But Trudeau did have a brief sit-down with Modi after the summit officially closed.
There's all sorts of different issues, and we've had serious and frank conversations, as Canadians would expect.
Trudeau says those issues did include Sikh separatism and a warning to India about foreign interference in Canada.
This was a very productive week.
The G20 was to cap off a week in this part of the world, where Trudeau met with Southeast Asian leaders at the ASEAN summit and with business investment heads in Singapore. But the week just got a little bit longer. Trudeau and the Canadian delegation were meant to fly back to Canada tonight. However, the government plane is broken, which means at least one more night in India. Karina Roman, CBC News, New Delhi.
Well, the leadership of the G20 is now in the hands of Brazil. But before Modi handed the ceremonial gavel to Brazil's president, Lula da Silva, he and other world leaders paid their respects to the man known as the father of India. G20 leaders stand before wreaths placed around a monument to Mahatma Gandhi. The monument is draped in orange and yellow garlands and surrounds an eternal flame. But the symbolism-rich ceremony has drawn condemnation from opposition parties and Modi's critics. The CBC South Asia correspondent Salima Shivji is in New Delhi for the G20, and I spoke with her earlier. Salima, India prepared for this G20 meeting meticulously. How did Prime Minister Modi use this summit to further his political goals at home?
Well, there were billboards everywhere promoting the G20, not just this weekend, but in the months leading up to it. The idea that India is a big player on the world stage was also meant to impress Indians at home. And the summit itself was heavy on symbolism for a domestic audience. There was Prime Minister Narendra Modi speaking to world leaders, welcoming them in front of a sign that read Bharat instead of India. It's also an official name for the country, but a more Hindu nationalist term dating back to ancient times. Promoting it or favoring it is a move that aligns with Modi's party, the BJP's electoral themes. There were also symbols aimed at foreigners during the summit. So world leaders gathered this morning at the Rajghat Memorial for Mahatma Gandhi, a global icon for peace and nonviolence, of course, for his role in opposing British rule. Modi draped hand-spun cotton scarves on U.S. President Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau as well, and others, a symbol of nonviolent resistance against the Raj, but also a sign of self-reliance that India could stand on its own, spin cotton, and dispense with its colonial rulers. It aligns with what Modi is trying to promote, a strong India, but using that image is also slightly problematic. Modi's party has been accused of trying to downgrade Gandhi's legacy and some of what he stood for, secularism in particular. Some passages on Gandhi and his accomplishments have recently been erased from Indian high school textbooks.
Okay, so now that the summit is over and deemed a success by Indian officials, what's next?
Well, Modi was so intent on ensuring the summit went off without a hitch that the Indian government effectively shut down large parts of Delhi. A massive security lockdown for 3 days. Shops were forced closed, people made to stay home, streets barricaded and inaccessible in the downtown core. Now, that meant a loss of income for vendors at street markets and around the capital. Many of those workers are now anxious to get back to work now that the world leaders have returned home. They want to earn money to feed their families. And for the Indian government, the summit's over. They've deemed it a success for the country's international image, but officials won't dwell on that for too long. There's a general election, of course, that they're now focused on, set for next year.
Okay, Salima, thanks so much for this.
You're welcome.
The CBC's South Asia correspondent Salima Shivji in New Delhi. Well, some members of the Sikh community in Canada have taken the G20 as an opportunity to draw attention to an issue that's led to tensions between the Canadian and Indian governments. Today in Surrey, BC, hundreds lined up to vote in a so-called referendum for an independent Khalistan state in northern India. The vote is not binding or even recognized in India, but as Yvette Brand reports, some in the community believe it's a significant, symbolic statement.
Hundreds gathered at the Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara in Surrey, BC this morning to vote. Their yellow Khalistan flagpoles spiked the blue sky. Most in this line aspire to an independent homeland for Sikhs. It's an image they hope is seen in India, where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has just wrapped up tense meetings with Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the G20 summit.
We've had serious and frank conversations, as Canadians would expect.
There's ongoing tension over a growing separatist movement among the 800,000 Canadian Sikhs, mostly in BC, Alberta, and Ontario. A U.S.-based group has been holding these so-called referendums for an independent state in Brampton, Mississauga, and now Surrey. They're not binding or even acknowledged in India, but Balpreet Singh of the World Sikh Organization of Canada says the symbolism is important.
The Indian narrative of Khalistan being a fringe element or a small minority, it simply doesn't hold water. Tens of thousands of people showed up. First one, estimates are approximately 100,000 people showed up to express their opinions on Khalistan. So that's a significant proportion of the Sikh population.
Sikhs for Justice leader Gurpadwant Singh Panam says, like Scotland, Khalistan seeks independence.
We are using the democratic pen, the power of the pen, to pierce it through India's AK-47.
Tensions between Sikhs and India spiked after a mid-June murder of BC Sikh leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar. India labelled him a terrorist who led a militant separatist group, an accusation denied by his supporters. Nijjar was killed by 2 masked gunmen in the temple parking lot, where young Sikhs lined up today.
What about India's comment on Canada? Recently, Prime Minister Trudeau is there, and they were saying that the Canadian government is harboring the Khalistani terrorists, anti-India people.
Honestly, I feel like the people that are saying that just don't have enough knowledge or education, because that's not what's going on here. We're so far away from being a terrorist. We're standing up for our own rights, our own justice.
Satwinder Bains, director of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley.
So I'm not surprised that young people today who are born in Canada, who are maybe first, second generation kids, are also enchanted by the idea of Khalistan and really believe that Khalistan is the only way.
But she has a warning.
I would say this democracy allows us to have these ideas, to continue to propagate them, to wave the flag, to have the referendums, but I don't know if it will have the impact in India.
Yvette Brand, CBC News, Vancouver.
Russian shelling has reportedly killed a Canadian aid worker this weekend in Ukraine. Anthony Tonko Inat and other volunteers were helping civilians near the front lines when their vehicle was struck. As Philip Lee Shannock reports, those who knew Inat say he was committed to helping others.
All of us came there from different parts of the world. Tonko is from Canada, and so am I.
Back in Toronto between tours, Adam Oak, a volunteer with Paracrew, a nonprofit humanitarian organization based in Norway, recalls meeting Anthony Inat, who he knew as Tonko, last March.
He was just a joy to be around. He was always willing to work, do everything he possibly could to help people in need.
The United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says 2 volunteers were killed and another 2 injured in the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, when their vehicle was reportedly hit during a strike. It says volunteers take on great risks to provide aid to all who need it. Oak plans to return to Ukraine in November.
We all know the risks that we take when we do this. And Tonko would say himself, he understands the risk, but knows that it's worth every single minute of it to help these people.
Paracrew says Enat was 58 years old. Irish aid worker Oren McInerney says he learned of his friend's death from other humanitarian volunteers.
In the area they were killed was incredibly close to the front line. It was incredibly close to Bakhmut. There would have been a lot of shelling.
In an Instagram post, group Road to Relief says they'd been in the area to help civilians caught in the crossfire to escape. Their vehicle was hit by Russian artillery, flipped over and caught fire. Enat and Road to Relief's director from Spain were killed. 2 others were injured. In a statement, Global Affairs Canada says it's aware of the death of a Canadian citizen in Ukraine. It added that officials are in contact with the family and are providing consular assistance. Ukraine's defense ministry blamed Russian terrorists for the attack on a civilian operation. George Beebe, director of Grand Strategy with the Virginia-based Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, says there should be a full investigation.
So whether the Russians were deliberately targeting this convoy, these humanitarian workers, and at this point I think it's too early to say.
The UN says so far this year at least 6 aid workers were killed and 16 injured in the line of duty in Ukraine. 4 were killed last year. And it says 100 security incidents against aid workers this year have suspended some humanitarian operations. Philip Lishanok, CBC News, Toronto.
About my resignation, yes, I'm going to do. I'm going to resign? Yeah, I'm going to, yes, because I cannot continue my work.
That's Spanish Football Federation President Luis Rubiales announcing his resignation in an interview with Piers Morgan. He's been engulfed in criticism after kissing star player Jenny Hermoso during the medal ceremony of the Women's World Cup last month. Hermoso says the kiss was not consensual and FIFA suspended Rubiales after he initially refused to step down. In a written statement, Rubiales says he is also stepping down as vice president of UEFA, the Union of European Football Associations. Last week, a Spanish prosecutor filed a complaint with the High Court against Rubiales for sexual assault and coercion. Life in Yellowknife is slowly returning to what it used to be. More health services will be back online this week as people continue to trickle home, including some of the city's most vulnerable. Yellowknifers who are homeless were scattered across Western Canada when the city was evacuated from a wildfire last month. Now, as Julia Wong tells us, work is underway to not only bring them back, but to support them when they get there.
I had fun here in Calgary. I got to tour Calgary Tower.
Dave Gagnon made the best out of a bad situation. As one of the few hundred people who experience homelessness in Yellowknife, he was forced from the streets more than 3 weeks ago as wildfire edged closer to the city. Gagnon spent his time in a Calgary shelter.
I can't wait to go back to Yellowknife.
Local agencies and government have been checking in with clients staying at shelters or hotels in cities across Western Canada. With Yellowknife now reopened, there's the monumental task of tracking people down and getting them home. Derek Plachinsky is the program manager for the Yellowknife Salvation Army.
It is much more challenging because in some cases there's individuals who may not have a cell phone or a cell phone that's working.
Well, we typically serve about 50 meals, lunchtime.
The Salvation Army has been getting ready to support the return of this vulnerable population. Executive Director Tony Brushett.
For some, I've heard the word, I've enjoyed my vacation. And sure, why not? But for those who were put down south, now they're put back up here again, and they're probably in their own mind wondering, what just happened to me?
Did you like the elders being there?
Yes, I love the elders being there.
That worry weighs on the mind of Tammy Roberts. She's the Executive Director of the youth shelter Home Base. 17 young people and 1 baby from the shelter were evacuated to a small northern Alberta community, packing the days with activities like time with elders, making arts and crafts, and swimming.
They really liked, having people 24/7 talk about, relationship problems that they may be having, or, challenges with family dynamics. We're dedicated to try and keep that consistency and connection going with the youth.
Wyatt Koza is one of them. He found different ways to pass the time while away.
I played the PS5, I played pool, went for a couple of walks, went to the gym. They had a gym down there, which I really enjoyed.
But the 21-year-old says he's excited to be in a familiar place again.
I'm just happy to be back in general.
And for those who are not, time is ticking. The territory says today is the last day for evacuees to get on re-entry flights from Edmonton and Calgary that are paid for and organized by the government. Julia Wong, CBC News, Yellowknife.
Tomorrow, people in Chile will mark the 50th anniversary of the military coup that overthrew the government of Salvador Allende. During the 17-year dictatorship that followed, thousands of Chileans were jailed, tortured, and killed. Many of them have been returning to the sites where they were tortured as part of the commemorations. At the same time, the far right in Chile is denying or downplaying the abuses that happened during that period. Marie Armel Laferrie reports from Santiago.
A group of former detainees breaks out into a socialist song. They're all in their late 60s and 70s now, but they've traveled from all over the country and around the world to gather in Chile's national stadium. In the days after the coup, as security forces rounded up opponents, it became the largest detention and torture center in the country, holding up to 20,000 people. Sergio Troncoso was one of them.
El ser sobreviviente es una gracia de Dios.
He says surviving the torture was a miracle. Many people died here. Next to him sits Luisa Duran. Duran says as soon as she entered the stadium, she could smell the blood of her friends tortured here. Both are sitting in Section 8 of the stadium, just behind the north goal. There are 9 rows of old wooden benches. Despite several renovations over the years, these benches have been kept just as they were in 1973, a reminder of the horrors that took place. Duran says she's still waiting for justice for what happened. She's also upset by recent comments made by the far right. Despite thousands of testimonials and hundreds of court cases, several MPs have downplayed or outright denied that there were human rights abuses during the dictatorship. And a poll earlier this year suggested 36% of the population thought the coup was justified. Isabel Castillo teaches political science at the Universidad de Chile. She isn't surprised by these numbers because the country remains highly polarized.
Not new. I don't think the overall support has for the dictatorship has increased all that much, but it's that is now much more open.
Castillo says these voices have simply become more mainstream. And she says after several wins at the polls, the far right is setting the agenda, fighting crime, not defending human rights.
The debate in previous years or the 40th anniversary was much more focused around this idea of never again and just trying to form a consensus around defense of human rights.
But the victims are trying to turn the spotlight back onto the abuses. Alvaro Gonzalez is vice president of the Association of the Relatives of the 1,400 people who disappeared during the dictatorship. He says the only way to fight denial is through stronger laws and more education. Since half of the population today wasn't born when the coup happened, the only hope of former detainees and their families is that their stories will teach the new generations about what really happened. Marie Armel Laferrie for CBC News, Santiago.
It is sometimes called Canada's forgotten battle. Operation Medak Pocket was fought 30 years ago this week. It took place in the former Yugoslavia and pitted Canadian and French troops on a peacekeeping mission against Croatian forces. The battle left a lasting legacy, including for Canada's top military commander. Murray Brewster has more with a CBC exclusive interview with General Wayne Eyre.
A quiet, understated ceremony in Ottawa to remember a battle few Canadians today have ever heard of. Medak, a village in the former Yugoslavia, caught in a gruesome civil war between Croats and Serbs. And in between them, Canadian peacekeepers including a future leader.
I was the battalion's reconnaissance platoon commander.
General Wayne Eyre, who is now the country's chief of the defense staff. He flips through YouTube videos of the UN mission on his phone.
So this one right here, that's actually my platoon.
Back in 1993, he was a young captain. This is the first time he's spoken publicly. At the time, Croatian forces launched an offensive to drive rebel Serbians out of the Krajina region. Canadian and French peacekeepers were fired on and expected to enforce a ceasefire near the village of Liki Sidlak.
We had moved forward to a Croatian roadblock, and we could hear the shooting, we could hear the burning, and we reported back that we believed that ethnic cleansing was happening.
The Canadian commander on the ground used the media to essentially shame the Croats into allowing them through. Once in the village, Eyre's worst fears were confirmed.
Every building in that village was on fire. The smoke, the flames is something I will never forget. And over the course of the next number of hours, we discovered a number of bodies. But I tell you, the smell is something that it took me years to move away from.
As many as 16 Serbian civilians were massacred, and Eyre's unit documented the evidence.
Much of the advice that I give now, much of the thinking about sending our soldiers into harm's way is based on my experience from that incident.
Lessons about support for troops both on and off the battlefield.
It's not Vimy Ridge, it's not Normandy.
Historian Andrew Birch.
The demand of the United Nations at that moment was not to buckle, and it didn't. And I think we'd be ill-served if we forgot about those chapters of our history.
The memory of Medak, however, is kept alive largely by those who were there. Retired Major General Lou Mackenzie also commanded peacekeepers the year before. He says Medak does not fit with the image Canadians have of peacekeeping.
It was never duly reported in Canada because they just couldn't understand from the government on down why are peacekeepers over there killing people.
It is important to note, Croatians have a different view of the battle. They say they fired in self-defense and never massacred anyone. Evidence collected by Eyre's team was used in the war crimes prosecution of a Croatian general, who was eventually acquitted. Murray Brewster, CBC News, Ottawa.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. Canada's Gabby Dabrowski is finally a Grand Slam champion. The 31-year-old from Ottawa and partner Erin Routliffe of New Zealand captured the women's doubles title at the U.S. Open in straight sets. This is Dabrowski's second trip to a Grand Slam final, following a loss in Wimbledon 4 years ago. She's the first Canadian to win a doubles major and Canada's first Grand Slam winner since Bianca Andreescu won the U.S. Open's singles title in 2019. Fuji Kaze there with Workin' Hard, the official theme song of this year's FIBA Basketball World Cup. You know who else has been working hard? The Canadian men's national team, which picked up its first ever World Cup medal, taking home the bronze with a movie-worthy win over the U.S.
They're playing basketball all around the world.
Leading the team to the 127-118 victory, Dylan Brooks. The 27-year-old from Mississauga is a forward for the Memphis Grizzlies, where he's known for being brash, boastful, an agitator. He may not be the most beloved figure in the NBA, but he's going down in the Canadian history books with a World Cup record, 39 points in a medal-winning game, and picking up the title Best Defensive Player of the tournament. Here's his message to anyone doubting his talents.
Just gotta ask, have you got anything you want to say to the haters?
I just appreciate you from the beginning. It just helps me get better and better each and every day. It just motivates me to keep going.
Now even Shaquille O'Neal's gotta admit, Brooks has got skills. Also solidifying his place on the Canadian basketball stage, coach Jordi Fernandez. Less than 3 months after taking over the top job from Nick Nurse, the Spaniard has proved he can lead a team to glory, even if it isn't always easy. Just listen to how he described the team's defense in a news conference just last week.
And I don't know if you guys know the line of the song. There's a song that says, "There's 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife." You guys know who sang that song?
I do.
Alanis Morissette, Canadian.
It's like 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife.
It's like embracing Canadiana even if no one else at the news conference does, don't you think?
And isn't it ironic?
Well, who needs irony when you've got a history-making bronze? So we'll give you this one, Jordi, and we'll leave you with a little more of Alanis Morissette, the Canadian.
It's like rain.
This has been The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Thanks for listening.